even in our analysis, I'll admit, everything that I had read told me we just dropped a financial thermonuclear bomb on Russia. Very possible that that could still be the case. However, in the short term, things are not going exactly as predicted and as planned. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is that despite Western sanctions, Russia's ruble and banks are recovering. So look at that chart, which is there on the right side of the screen. Now, for those who are just listening, the official ruble exchange for the dollar was 75 before the war began. It plunged to 120, obviously. Then, though, in the period of the next month, it has climbed from 120 back up to 84. So down, to be sure, certainly in terms of where it was previously. But, Krystal, I don't think that that was the picture that was painted for the American people and for the world in terms of the long-term impact of the actual economy. And on all sides, we are beginning to see some strength on the part of the Russians. Let's put this up there on the screen. Russia's Gazprom has actually exited German business amid the crisis in energy ties. Now, it's not the other way around. It's not the Germans who are pulling out of the deal. It's Gazprom saying it is quitting its business in Germany. And the reason why is very clearly some of these sanctions, and it is a move by the Russian government in order to put the squeeze on the Germans who have left themselves tremendously vulnerable in terms of natural gas.
There's another piece they mentioned here as well, though, which is that a German business daily had just reported on Thursday that the German economy ministry was considering nationalizing both Gazprom and Rosneft units in the country amid concerns about the security of energy supply. So Germany was considering taking their assets, basically nationalizing it. Russia obviously took this opportunity to say, we're gonna take this back before you can do this.
Another thing that goes to show you in terms of the power of the Russian government is that they are now requiring those payments in rubles, which, what does that do? It's a backstop to the actual currency, very similar to some of the petrodollar discourse. By requiring that, they're actually inflating the price there of the ruble and keeping something to an inelastic product, which is gas and oil, which of course is very expensive right now. Even at the discounted Russian rates, they're still making a killing over there. So what it goes to show you in terms of all of this is that the exports are backing the Russian ruble, and that as much as you can try to cut off Russian exports and that from the global economy, it's really not possible, especially whenever we're talking about petroleum, and especially whenever you don't have China and India on board, two of the largest consumers of petroleum products on the global stage.
So I talked to our friend Igor about some of this.
Yeah, what does he think?
He thinks that the picture they're painting here is too rosy and that Russia is taking a bigger hit than than this article was ultimately projecting, or as reflected in the exchange rate of the ruble at this point.
Possible.
And basically what he was pointing to, and this makes some sense to me, is that Russians follow the strength of the ruble very closely, so this would be a metric that everybody would kind of be paying attention to. And so Putin has engaged in sort of extraordinary lengths to prop up the value of the ruble. One of the things that the Washington Post mentions is that the central bank in late February began requiring exporting companies to exchange 80% of their hard currency revenue for rubles. That created new demand for Russia's currency, as you said, also demanding payments in rubles. So he's using these sort of extraordinary measures to help artificially prop up the value of the ruble, and that helps to hide some of the economic calamity. I think it likely still is not as extreme as what was projected. And then this is the other important piece of this, which is that not only has the economic fallout not been what was ultimately anticipated or projected, but the sanctions we have levied are really backfiring. They're doing exactly what, they have done in Iran, North Korea, and Cuba, and Venezuela, and all these other places that we tried to do this, which is it's actually strengthening the hand of the regime. Yeah, it's terrible for the people. It's very hard on the people, but ultimately the regime stays in power. Let's go ahead and put Ross Douthat here had a good piece on this. this is as bold as you could be in the New York Times in proclaiming effectively that our sanctions have been foolish and have backfired. He writes, Putin is losing in Ukraine, but he is winning in Russia. He said, yes, failed wars sometimes bring down authoritarian regimes, like in Argentina after its misadventure in the Falkland Islands, but externally imposed sanctions, economic warfare often end up strengthening the internal power of the targeted regime. In the short run, they supply an external scapegoat, an obvious enemy to blame for hardship instead of your own leaders. In the long run, the academic literature suggests they make states more repressive and less likely to democratize. He closes by saying, no, if we intend to make economic war on Russia for a generation, we should be clear-eyed about the calculus. In the hopes of making a dangerous great power as weak as possible, we will make it more likely that Putinism rules for decades and that Russia remains our deadly enemy for as long as anyone can reasonably foresee. Is that the outcome that you were sold? And is that the outcome that you ultimately want? Because that is what these indiscriminate sanctions that hit the entire population, that's the reality they're creating.
Another thing that Ross points to, and I think is really important, is that in the previous era, Putin was not the only game in town. And you saw this by oligarchs gallivanting all around Europe, having business in London. I mean, they even made jokes in London. They're like, oh, this is little Moscow. You know, in Cyprus, all over Europe. Anytime you travel, some of the richest people that you'll find, even New York, I mean, a lot of these people are Russian. And they're using their capital, usually ill-gotten, and washing it through legitimate Western financial institutions. Well, what Ross points to is that with the total declaration of economic war on Russia, he has actually united the Russian elite in a way that has not existed under his entire tenure in office, because now Russians understand the only way to survive is Putin. We have to support Putin because we have no other options available to us in the global economy. For every, one oligarch that might say one thing, the rest of them are 100% behind him. They have no other ability in order to maintain wealth, Krystal.
Right.
So when you consider that, you've united the Russian elite. The history of Russian revolutions, both the Tsar and the Bolshevik Revolution, also the Soviet Union, is when the Russian elite abandoned the political project. Unfortunately, in Russia, the history of Russia tells us that what the peasant class or the normal worker wants there really doesn't matter all that much.
Yeah.
And Igor, told us, he's like, yeah, the people want the war to end, but it doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter.
In terms of
Not relevant.
Right. And so we've actually united the entire Russian elite against us and towards Putin. And he could die tomorrow, and I think some form of his regime would still endure for decades.
Possibly
that's essentially
someone even worse.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the kind of conditions we're creating right now. I think that's really important. I also think there's been a lot of kind of triumphalist conversation about the brain drain as educated elites flee Russia, which I think is a real phenomenon that's happening. That's not necessarily bad for Putin, guys. I mean, some of these folks were like the liberal opposition within the country. So for him to push them out of the state, again, that sort of strengthens his hand internally and domestically. We covered the guy who was like the highest level Kremlin advisor to resign. He'd been I'm blanking on his name because I'm terrible at remembering names, but he was like the architect of the 90s era neoliberal reforms. He essentially like architected the oligarchic system in Russia. He was very well known. And he kind of been kept in place in a high level as more of like a figurehead and a token and a symbol than having any actual power. But, that guy left, and that's emblematic of how the sort of more liberal opposition wing is. The ones who aren't down for it, they're leaving, and what that leaves in place is the ones who are sort of like hardliners and down for the cause, or have decided they have to be down for the cause because their wealth depends on it.
Yeah, that's just an honest conversation about how things are actually going there.
Yep, and once again, one that you're very unlikely to hear in mainstream press, even though we really need to understand, because we rushed into all of this, what the consequences of our actions ultimately are, and have a clear understanding of what are our policy goals. I mean, we don't even have like honest talk from the Biden administration about what our real goals here ultimately are. So that's why this matters. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.